Well, welcome Caspar and YuJune, and welcome everybody who is attending this lovely talk. We're so excited really to have you. Synoptic Office is a design consultancy that was founded by both of them, brilliant minds here, and they are working with global and cultural organizations, but also civic and business organizations. Their work has so much range, which is quite amazing. Both of them are also design educator, which also is really exciting. So there is really a lot of interdisciplinarity in here. Synoptic Office has been recognized internationally, and a couple of their clients are, for instance, Bloomberg Market or Guggenheim, the museum, Met, Pentagram, or Yale University. So really exciting stuff happening. But I would really invite you to go to actually their website and just check what they do and read their ideas. It's really lovely and full of insights that are quite magical to me, actually. And without further ado, I think we can welcome them very warmly in here.
Hi, I'm YuJune Park.
Hi, I'm Caspar Lam.
And we're Synoptic Office. And today we'll be sharing a little bit about collection practices for type designers. So our studio, Synoptic Office, our passion is working with organizations to reveal connections through design, language, and information. Part of this means we work with a lot of collections and archives to find and tell hidden stories from a group of objects. A collection can be many things. For example, with this project we did for Art Store, it could be a collection of photographs, or it could be collections about an architect, in this case, Marcel Breuer, and his life's work and drawings. A collection can also be a set of laws, such as in this project for the House of Representatives, or it could be a collection of news stories from around the world. And what drives our work is the belief that the potential of any collection is based on the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. For example, we have this one object, but when you put it in context to other objects, you begin to see patterns and new stories emerge. A collection becomes interesting because patterns and rules emerge from the set of things. As type designers, we often look at historical references while designing type, but Caspar and I, we're really passionate about looking at collections of things and even collections of typeface because we begin to see and learn from sort of the larger visual, historical, cultural trends at hand. And we really believe in this idea of cyclical influences, with a collection of items and then seeing its patterns and rules. Type designers know this very well since a script is a collection. It's a collection of glyphs. But what happens when we begin to apply this idea to a set of typefaces? We quickly encounter a lot of questions about the very nature of typography. This brings us to a project that we've been working on for the last few years called the Chinese Type Archive, and it was born of both a dual passion in typography and in collections. And the Chinese Type Archive is an ongoing collaborative open access index of Chinese typographic resources. And it began with our own collection of books around Chinese typography that we began collecting many, many years ago. And the goals of the Chinese Type Archives was to enable access to these resources, broaden context around Chinese typography, and really become a starting point for critical making. So we divided the Chinese Type Archive into 3 types of records. First, we had typefaces, then concepts around Chinese typography, and lastly, resources, most notably books around Chinese type. Here you can see another shot of the Chinese Type Archive. We also included things like collection of concepts around Chinese typography. And through this ongoing process of collecting, The project is a method of exploring the domain of Chinese typography. We currently have over 230 seed records. We have over 800. We started with 230 seed records. Now we have over 800 with an additional 300 in the queue. And this project was sponsored with support from the AIGA as well as with Parsons School of Design. And it was a wonderful project that we did in collaboration with our editors, Mac Wang and Stephanie Winarto, and a large group of researchers from around the world. And taking a step back from this project, we asked ourselves, what can we learn from the process of collecting and organizing typefaces? We'll focus on two primary questions in this talk. One is what typefaces should be collected? And two, how can typefaces be organized?
So starting with this first question, what typefaces should be collected? We're really thinking about, what is the smallest unit to collect? So anytime you have a collection, let's say you have a collection of stamps or a collection of artworks, a discrete object or a small object it would be the stamp or would be the work of art. Now, in the context of collecting typefaces, we're really thinking about the typeface as a discrete object, right? It is the smallest thing to collect, the item in the collection. But this gets very interesting because when we think about a typeface, ultimately we're trying to capture the visual idea of a typeface because that's what has value to us as designers. But the visual idea actually is an idea, and so in order to show it, we need to have a visual surrogate or the things that comprise that visual idea. So that might be a drawing, that might be the lead type, that might be the wooden type, because they are evidence of this idea. And that actually leads to this very existential question is, well, what is a typeface? Because it's not as easy as it seems. We might start with a very sort of basic definition. A typeface is a set of lead type, or usually lead type. When we think about it, we might have an image like this in mind. So this is a set of Chinese type at the Haas Family Arts Library at Yale. And so this is sort of lead type made by the commercial press in Shanghai. And so this is, a very sort of archetypical image of a typeface. A lot of our English terms come from this era of lead type. And when we think about it on a very abstract level, creating this type of cast lead type involves, somebody who makes it, the creator. They might make a punch and then the matrices and things like that in order to create the type. And so there's this kind of translation process that goes on. Now, of course, the elephant in the room is that when we think about type, there's also a lot of wooden type. But if we abstract it, it comes out to be a little bit different. So here, actually, this is an example of Chinese wood type that's, of course, cut. This is from the 18th century. One of the things, of course, about wood type is that each piece is cut individually. So you can, of course, see kind of the imperfections that are actually different, even if it's the same character. On an abstract level, cut type, wood type, you have a creator, and then it's immediately that visual idea goes into the typeface, right? Each block is kind of unique. It's its own thing. There's none of that kind of immediate process where you have that large amount of reproducibility. And so this actually opens the door to some very interesting questions about what a typeface is. Because if you think about looking back at cast type, because you have that intermediate process, we might say that the typeface could be all those things, including that intermediate process, the punches, the matrices, the type, all those things. And in fact, it kind of mirrors our kind of the way that we work with type now when we have software programs like RoboFonts or Glyphs. The typeface is a font file that's distributed, that's reproducible. But in the instance of cut type, let's say wood type, the final artifact is actually just the wooden type itself, right? Oftentimes, there may or may not actually be any drawings in the middle. It would just be the wood type. And so it begs the question, well, should every non-cast typeface be collected as a unique typeface? And the reason why we ask this question and it becomes like a slippery one is because if you say yes, you might have to omit things like stamping. Well, what about lettering and handwriting? Are those things typefaces? And actually, if you look at the whole plethora of techniques, right, everything from say handwriting to sort of algorithmically generated typefaces, the range of techniques reflects sort of different degrees of mass production, of standardization, and its relationship to typography is always just a little bit different, right? We don't consider handwriting to be typography, but what about things like lettering and calligraphy? Those things are actually very interesting and open questions. Or even say things like stamps. How is that different than say wood type? And the reason why we think a lot about this question is that we can't ignore this because the vast majority of Chinese typefaces before the 20th century are cut; they're not cast. And ignoring this would mean missing out on a large portion of type history. Part of this, of course, is because when we think about Western type, there is this relationship between writing and image, and type kind of slips and slides in between. It's somewhere in the middle, which makes it a lot of fun, but it's also sort of malleable, but it's also very difficult to pinpoint down. In Chinese type, there are also other reference points. There's references to calligraphy. There's references to a very distinct tradition of Chinese lettering called Meizhi. And so the entire kind of apparatus, sort of way you think about type is a little bit different. Just to kind of illustrate what this Chinese lettering is, you can see that it looks very, very different than what you would see as sort of standard Chinese characters. It's a lot more expressive. There's a lot of variation. This type of lettering, it can go really, really abstract and crazy. And so the observation that we've come to is that knowing the boundaries of a collection is really not that easy. Now, to solve this, one could argue that a collection should only include complete typefaces, right? So we could say, well, we're going to collect typefaces, but we only include things that are done, that are complete, or perhaps a degree of completeness. If they're stable, they're not changing, they're finished. Now, this may make sense in an alphabetic context, right? Because an alphabet, you say it's for English, you've got 26 letters, you make the typeface, you add in some punctuation, it's kind of done. But in Chinese, the tables are a little bit turned because typefaces in general are not complete. And so the reason why we say this is that, well, it comes from the nature of the language itself. Chinese characters are logosyllabic. So what that means is that the characters can mean, objects, they can mean ideas, but they can also mean sounds. And different characters can be put together to make words. The components within the characters can also be combined historically to create words. And so depending on how you count the number of present day modern characters along with historical ones, it could run up to 85,000 different types of characters. And so the idea of completeness is also subject to sort of discussion. Is it, the minimum for literacy, which is, around 3,000? Is it a university graduate, which is 8,000? Or do you go all in, include historical variants, which, can run up to 85,000 or more? The other thing too is that, generally Chinese typefaces are created over a long time by many individuals. This is true for all sorts of non-Chinese typefaces or Latin typefaces, but it's distinctly true for Chinese typefaces. One historical example that we want to give is the Hong Kong font, and we're going to use this because it kind of illustrates perhaps the complexity of how do you describe this process? How do you describe a typeface? So on the right here, we have the Hong Kong font. And then on the left here, we have the Dyer font, which is actually its predecessor. And the two of them actually have a relationship. So just looking at this on a historical level, Samuel Dyer actually starts his investigations in creating a Chinese font in Penang in the 1830s. This typeface actually, from beginning to completion took, over 30 years. Dyer actually dies in Singapore. His work gets handed over to Alexander, who tries to complete it, but he actually increases the number of characters. The press is transferred to Hong Kong, and that's when Richard Coe takes over, and he actually recuts a large portion of the typeface. And so this is why there's this sort of historic distinction between, what is known as the Dyer font versus the Hong Kong font, but they're actually related. One is the predecessor of the other. Now, the interesting thing is that Richard leaves, and then the rest of the font is completed by the London Missionary Society. And so the number of characters in the typeface goes from around 1800 in Dyer's day all the way to 6,000 by the time that the font is sort of in full use. Now, in our archive, it's listed as two different typefaces for historical reasons. But really, when we're looking at this, we have this question of, well, aren't they related? Aren't they perhaps even the same typeface, right? I mean, it's a matter of judgment, because where does one typeface begin and another end? And in fact, there are also other edge cases that are very hard to describe, hard to categorize. Things like historic revivals, digitizations, type within multiple orthographies. When we say orthographies, in Chinese, there's traditional and there's simplified Chinese. So those are two orthographies, or two different ways of writing the same script. And then, of course, in modern day, there's multilingual type families, especially these huge superfamilies that we see. And in relation to this too, because everything now is computer-based, more and more designers are using things like GitHub to software version. You might even think about, say, like future fonts as a way of thinking about sort of the idea of a typeface that's not yet complete, but in progression. And software versioning kind of always has this idea that things are in progress, that they're just stages in this sort of forever journey towards completeness, whenever that completeness comes to be. And so it really brings up this idea for us, is that perhaps typefaces should be seen as evolving lineages rather than static objects. And that in of itself is a really interesting idea.
So this brings us to our second question: how can typefaces be organized? When we start to organize or catalog, we have to assign a structured language. We start with metadata, or data about data. For example, we have this work of art in the center. The metadata would be things like the title, the genre, the artist, or the medium. Metadata is what allows us to describe things in a shared way. And it also allows computers to easily store, retrieve, and network records. One observation that we made throughout our kind of work with collections is that we tend towards simplicity, describing the collection simply and then progressively adding complexity. And so just to do a thought experiment, what would be the minimal kind of metadata needed to describe a typeface? You would think of things like a unique identifier, a typeface name, the creator date, material, or technique. But while working with the Chinese Type Archive, we kind of expanded this list to capture some of the information that we saw. Caspar just spoke about the Hong Kong typeface. We had multiple people working on it over the course of several decades. How can we begin to capture this information? So we began to add things like a begin date and end date. And imagine we took this even further. So a more extensive typeface record would allow us to describe relationships in more specific ways. For example, with people, we could talk about their name, but also the role that they played and when they played that role. Or when we list a date, we can talk about when the project began, when it ended, or when we talk about style, we could talk about also things like the size and the weight. And these relationships become really important, especially when we began to talk about related typefaces. What was the original? What was the revival? Where does one typeface begin? And when does another one? And when does it end? And so this brings us to a lot of questions about how do you capture this information? Descriptive structures reflect different ideas about typography.
And what this really means is that the way that you catalog, the way you describe the typefaces, the way you describe a collection, kind of really reflects the understanding of what those things are, what typography is. So to give another sort of historical example, this one is from the late 80s. It's a book by a couple of Chinese computer scientists called Introduction to Chinese, Japanese, and Korean Computing. And in the back flap, they actually have this breakdown of how they see Chinese characters in the context of computer technology and also, of course, overlapping with the idea of typefaces. If we zoom into one particular portion of this diagram and looking at this on the bottom right here, they list things like underline, italic, outline, and shadow as part of a character's style. This kind of makes sense from a computer scientist's point of view because these are really just transformations applied to something that already exists. It's applied to a set of instructions. So, for instance, their idea of an italic is, well, you take a typeface and you skew it. That's the italic. Obviously, this is anathema to type designers. And in fact, all of these types of ideas, the underline, the italic, outlines, and shadows, could very well be different types of typefaces or perhaps different fonts within the typeface family. But for the computer scientists, they're all really the same thing. And so the way that they've broken this down kind of reflects an understanding of typography that's very different than a designer's point of view of what typography is. And this is what we mean about the way things are structured, the way you describe things, that it actually reflects how that thing, that collection is viewed. And as we encounter new typefaces, as new technologies arise, the way that we may have described type in the past may not be adequate. Even the way that we talk about this, the way that we catalog it currently, may not be accurate. And so it really leads to a conclusion or, a very sort of sobering thought is that, cataloging in this descriptive process is never complete. We want to end by saying that, through the process of collecting and organizing, it allows us to begin to interrogate our evolving notions of type. And so one of the things that we find really exciting about collecting typefaces, thinking about them, describing them, organizing them, is that it allows us to sort of put all of these things in perspective, both in the present day, but also in relation to the past and also to future forms that might arise. And so we really encourage sort of type designers actually to really think about the typeface references that they have, to begin to actually collate them, to collect them, to organize them, because it will actually bring out some very interesting ideas about what typography is. And so we first want to say thank you to the ATypI organizers, of course, and also thank you for listening to this. And feel free to reach us at info@synopticoffice.com. Follow us on Instagram, Synoptic Office, and of course the Chinese Type Archive is.
Oh, that was wonderful.
Thank you so much for this amazing talk, really. It did not even feel that it wasn't live. It was so good.
We're happy to open the floor to questions.
I think we have a few already.
Ollie, yeah. I thought Chinese italics just basically does not exist. Am I wrong? You are right.
You are right, yes. Okay.
There are no italics.
So, if I may, I had I have so many questions, but I'm going to limit it to one, I think, or I'm going to try to, and let somebody else weigh in. So when you are trying to create a record of a typeface, or think about that, and even in the case of like the Penang versus the Hong Kong typeface, where you view it in a sense as a continuation, but you could argue that it's really two different ones. And then I would apply the same thing to somebody today who goes and, quote unquote, completes a typeface by creating the italics for something that had previously never been drawn. Have you come up with a way, like a parentage of sorts in the way those records might relate?
No, I mean, this is where we started with the simplest cataloging method possible. YuJune mentioned the kind of flat structure that we adopted, and we adopted it for a couple of reasons. over cataloging is as dangerous as under cataloging. Actually, we've worked on projects where the curators and scholars have really gone hog wild, like trying to capture everything. And then at the end of the day, you never do anything because you just sit around thinking about all the million edge cases. So what we actually did was to adopt the dumbest way of cataloging, and we just called it two different typefaces because of historical conventions, and also just taking it at face value of what people said it was. And that's actually what you see currently on the Type Archive website. The idea of the relationships between typefaces, that's something that we are exploring because that actually then brings a level of richness to it. There are precedents in the art history world for doing this. So for instance, Getty has this vocabulary, they call it a vocabulary, which is a controlled kind of catalog of sorts of names and things. They have a thing called Kona, where you can actually relate works of art to each other, and you can then define, you have a definition of the types of relationships. And so we're actually, in order to relate these typefaces together, we actually have to understand what kind of relationships might exist. Obviously, we can, we have historical revival. I think everybody knows that. In the case of this one for a Hong Kong font, like, what do we call it? Is it completion? Is it a refabrication? Is it, right? Those terms also matter too. And so it's, having at least some idea of how we might want to use those terms consistently allows us then to go back and say, okay, these things might be related. And actually then, from our perspective, like, is really exciting because then you can start to run it through a computer and then you can actually map these things out. That's our ultimate dream, but, we haven't gotten there yet.
We're working towards it.
So Oli is asking, how do you search within the archive? Is there any search integrated?
Yeah, that's another one. Yes. I think people here are very astute. Yeah. So things like images and search functionality, that's actually in our second round that we're doing right now. So when we started with and this goes a little, I'm not sure how much people want to hear about technical backend things, but
yes,
a lot. Yeah. So when we adopted this, right, when we started this, we actually had a kind of a complicated table relationship setup, and because we were working within, we had some research assistants and we had just a little bit of funding. When I say a little bit, we were meaning like not very significant. And so our assistant said, oh, well, why don't we build it in WordPress? And we were kind of like, maybe not the best, but, it's fine for now because at least it has the tables, we can export the data. And what it turned out to be was WordPress can handle our data very well. And so we immediately rebuilt it actually. And it now actually runs on Vue.js. And so we have a very rudimentary kind of sort of backend structure for it. And as yet, we haven't put in the search, which is something that we're working on now because we then need to convert it into a full sort of a full-fledged kind of CRM setup in the back end. The problem with all of this too is that and it's taking us a little bit of time to kind of figure it out, and we're still in the process of figuring out, is we don't want to lock ourselves into any type of proprietary structure, because once you do it, you tend to, there's a lot of inertia. You just kind of keep on going with whatever thing you set up. And as YuJune mentioned, we adopted the flat structure so that it gives us that flexibility. Because we're really kind of creating something that's super custom, and the collection kind of speaks to you as to what that database structure needs to be. And so we've been just a little bit slow on that.
We adopted a really kind of flat hierarchy, but I also think we also wanted to learn from the archive. And so when we launched it, it's a way to kind of put out a little bit of an MVP. And and then kind of test it and see how the data speaks back to us, and that we would take what we've learned and kind of roll that into the second round of the archive.
I know everybody. Sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to getting some of the questions here, but you might have something to follow up on that.
actually do. I'm wondering, do you think if depending on who collects the data, that there is either a loss of culture or there is actually the opposite and a reveal of culture? For instance, I know that some historic Chinese typefaces did not have names, and yet they are categorized with numbers, for instance, right? How is that dealt with?
Yeah. So for us, our early decision was to give everything a unique identifier. So if you go on the archive, everything has a unique ID. Because even within sort of literature on Chinese type, people refer to things very differently. Like the Penang font and then the Dyer font, like sometimes they're interchangeable, and then there's actually like the secondary kind of knockoff version, not a knockoff, but like prototype version. It actually gets very confusing. And it's actually one of the reasons why we started it, because when we were reading through all the materials, we got confused. We're like, wait, they're talking about this typeface, but there's no name. So they're describing in weird ways. They're like, oh, so-and-so made this typeface in the 1950s, or like, sorry, 1850s. And we're like, which one are they talking about? Because there might be one or two, and then you have to kind of read between the lines and guess. And it just became really, it just became annoying. So, I mean, to try to sort of understand where all these things got put together. So when we do name things, we either name it through historic convention, or we just give it the name of the person or the place it was made, which is how many of these typefaces names kind of came about. One thing that we are also putting in here, which isn't shown in the archive, is that every piece of data can also be referenced to a particular source. That's not exposed on the archive. And so that's also something that we want to put in so that people know where these things came from. But again, all of this is very tedious and slow work. Yeah, so.
Well, that's what strikes me as most interesting about this, and it is sort of an emerging story, is the better the metadata, the more interesting things you find. And so I guess that's kind of like, that begs the next question, which I know how hard it is to collect and maintain and be diligent about adding the metadata. And how has that process been for you?
It's slow.
Slow.
I mean, oh yeah, go ahead.
It has to be cross-referenced, and we actually have a pretty kind of rigorous process for doing that, where there will be several eyes on each entry before it's published. So it's a slow and tedious process.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing too is, we do this kind of on our sort of volunteer basis, right? All the people that work on this. So it's not, it's not our sort of full-time job. It's more, with spare moments. So the entire process is actually excruciatingly slow, but it's also, a lot of fun for us because we kind of find a lot of things within it. But yeah, I think the cross-referencing part is also very difficult, because the sources themselves, they sometimes cite sources of sources. And if you actually look at sort of some of the Chinese type literature or some of the earlier books, right, they don't really quite sort of tell you where the primary materials are, or it might have been lost. And so it just depends on the typefaces. The more recent fonts are really easy because you can get it from the horse's mouth, right? You can get it from the type foundry, and they often list the designers and things like that. So that's quite easy. And so you see that there is actually a swath of contemporary typefaces there. There are obviously a lot more that we haven't put in. They're the ones that are in the queue that we still actually review. Do a review before we put it in. But there's kind of gaps throughout the entire archive, and you'll notice them once you start to kind of poke around.
It does sound like a tedious process. It sounds like a tedious process, I was saying, but I think it's really important work that you're doing, to be honest. Which kind of brings to one question that was asked in the in the Q&A by Sophia. Do you have any plans to include images on the website to show what the typefaces look like? Something like the
Yes.
Or yeah.
We do. We do, yeah.
We do.
No, that's a really good kind of a reference. It was one of the sites that we actually looked at before we started this. Well, I mean, there are a couple of ways to do this, right? It's an unfortunate reality that some of the more historical ones that we have in our books, the books themselves are not printed very well. And so the images are extremely fuzzy. So they're kind of no good there. The second one is also we're very kind of I would say paranoid, I would be the best word, about image rights. And it comes from sort of maybe us working too much with museums and dealing with artists and images. So we've kind of like put that as like a lower priority. Not that it's not a high priority. It's just we just don't have the bandwidth to kind of process those types of things. We have been talking with Fonts and Use, with Stephen Coe and Fonts and Use, because it's a nice way, because they kind of generate a lot of images of types in use, right? And so for us, our interest is that if we're able to link those things together, we can begin to see how certain typefaces are used in the wild, and then we can then focus on obtaining like the actual typeface specimens or like linking them out to where the sources are. So that's for us is like a ongoing sort of phase 1.5.2 type of thing. For us, it's actually quite a huge undertaking, and so we've tended to focus on the data first, so that at least we have a list of things that we need to now go get. So yes, we're also we get that question a lot, and we actually do have images on our own personal hard drives, but we're just not able to share them because we don't know what the rights are to them, which is really, really sad. But it's something that's really weighs heavily on our minds. Yeah.
But one thing we do is in the resource section of the archive, for every kind of book that we list, we do provide the WorldCat link, which is points you to where in the world you can find this book. It's kind of the index for all library. It's an index that kind of points you to which library you can actually find all of these books. And so we hope that that could be a helpful resource to people as they kind of embark on their own research.
So there's another question about whether or not you think any of the sort of Western typeface classification methods could be used. For example, ductus, skeleton, contrast, proportion, anything like that. I mean, it's like kind of like the topic of the week, I guess.
It is. I mean, we saw we saw the previous talk today. So this one is a really difficult one. I don't know if people in the audience know, Mariko Takagi wrote a book called Hanzigraphy, which has kind of her ideas of sort of German, sort of Chinese type classifications, which does utilize some of these ideas. In general, we've actually been talking with our editors, Mac and Stephanie, a lot recently about this, because we don't have a very good sense as to how to classify these typefaces. At the very beginning, we were actually very naive. We were like, oh yeah, it's very easy, right? You're gonna have these couple of major type families, we call it a day. And that's kind of, I don't want to like kind of be too forward in this, but if you look at Chinese type foundries, they do kind of have, each one has a little bit of an idiosyncratic take on this kind of major type family classification, which is actually very similar to Latin typeface foundries too, right? You have your like, here's a serif, here's a sans serif, but they don't really mean anything. They're more kind of consumer oriented, and so for us, we've been scratching our heads a lot as to how to begin to classify them, because it does it does get into very, very murky territory. And so one territory that I'll use an example is there are now many typefaces that are kind of hybridized forms. So if you look at sort of the early typefaces, you might have said like the Song style or Ming style typefaces. That's kind of easy to recognize. That's like one family. You might have your He style, that's also easy. But now there's a lot of like mixing and kind of, like crossbreeding. And so then it's like, how do you start to describe these? And there's more and more of them now. We've kind of played around with different ways of calling them, but none of them actually feel very robust. In a way too, I mean, I mean, I don't know if it's like I don't want to say it's a hopeless mission. I mean, I know that, we've looked at sort of past typeface classifications for Latin scripts, and even that, right, it's a big deal. It kind of blew up. Like people kind of were like, forget this for a while, and then there's interest, and it's just kind of comes back and goes back and forth again. So we are, and so this is where sort of these ideas about the evolutionary lineages come to be useful to us, because it's maybe a better way of describing the entire time span of these typefaces, rather than sort of putting them into these fixed categories, which may or may not be accurate. And so that time dimension is something that we're still kind of trying to figure out how to best put these things in relation to each other. More like an evolutionary tree, I guess.
That's really fascinating. I mean, I think so. As somebody that didn't study type design, my graphic design program was relatively limited in the type classes that were taught. I've sort of come to this stuff much later and really on my own in a more self-directed way. And the lingo is always the hardest thing for me. And feeling like I sort of like I missed out on the memo of like how I should be talking about these things. And I think that's where we struggle in a way to connect type to people who are not of us, are not already on the inside to communicate that. And I think that's where there's always this desire to put a simple word on it.
Right.
It's a serif, it's a sans serif, it's a hey, it's a ming. That but I think that does a disservice to all of it, and that's unfortunate. I really like this notion of maybe it's really talking about the origin more than the box that you put it in.
I mean, this even extends to the concepts, right? Like Caspar and I talked, like, how do you even talk about typefaces, like, let alone categorize them, right? And we were saying even with Chinese typography that there are several different ways that we talk about the same thing.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. And then, I mean, at the end of the day too, then, that in order to have that kind of lineage, it goes back to kind of the really grunt work of maybe just capturing a sizable sample so that we can then demonstrate that idea, which is where we're still currently at, unfortunately.
Right.
So,
well,
we'll
Well, so here's another question from Wing Sum Yao, who is from Hong Kong, and asked if you'd considered partnering with universities because he's surprised he'd never heard of the archive.
Yeah, well, we would love to. I think, for us, because it's one of so many projects that we're doing, it definitely, it's on like a slow trajectory arc. So it is one of the things that we're very interested in, because we do want the project to fly. And even on the site, we are trying to get sort of volunteers and collaborators. But at the end of the day, it sometimes falls on us and the small team to kind of push it forward. And things that are kind of voluntary are, I mean, I think everybody knows, it's just what we can do to push it forward. So
we have connected with faculty though from various institutions, and it's definitely an ongoing conversation.
Yeah.
Which actually leads me to this point of curiosity that I have. I'm wondering how to constantly thinking about this, like how to kind of present alternative narratives and how students can investigate those alternative narratives, which, your research process is definitely one of these, of trying to reveal these alternative narratives. And I wonder if you could actually elaborate on that. How do you engage, because both of you are educators, how do you engage with your students in the same endeavor, for instance?
You mean in terms of these alternative narratives or from different cultures? Yeah. I mean, I think this is something, I don't know if YuJune knows this, but this is something that's also weighs heavily on our minds. I think the first thing that we tell students is to actually, I mean, it sounds obvious after you've seen the presentation, is to collect a lot of things, because for us, when they come to us with their projects, I mean, we have students that come from, of course, China, but also South America, Brazil, India, sort of all over the place, right? I mean, we're not, I know nothing about index scripts. And so we actually asked them, if they want to propose any type of idea like that or want to investigate things, that they come with some sort of collection and some sort of body of um, evidence or things to look at, because it's there that we can actually meet them, right? We can all kind of talk about what we see, because we are all human beings. We have eyes. We can kind of actually talk about these things, right? And kind of describe them in various ways. And that becomes the start of a dialogue, because it then allows them to think about how they actually want to talk about those things, how to sort of create form based on that, but also perhaps how to evolve it and translate it for other types of contexts. It's of course a very different process than if they were in their home countries and sort of talking to, all Chinese people or all Russians or all, Indians, things like that. So I don't know if YuJune.
I mean, it's something that we talk about all the time, because the reality is our students will be graduating into a world where we're going to be practicing design in a multicultural context, and how do we best prepare them to do this, especially in how we teach typography. And one reality, I guess we press up against, and all faculty probably press up against, is we cannot teach all scripts. We don't have that expertise in-house, so we approach this with a lot of, I think, humility and openness. And what we're trying to do a little bit at Parsons is try to make our program a little bit of a crossroads. And by what we mean by that is actually connecting our students to design communities that are deeply rooted in a script, in a culture, and trying to create these points of connection so that the students can kind of connect with that expertise. The faculty can also learn, and perhaps we build out that design community. So we try to foster an environment where these connections can happen, where we can support the work that these communities are doing, and also create an avenue in which we can share knowledge, sort of becoming like a distributed network.
But it does rely a lot on the student. I mean, it is not all students, I would say, are capable of doing it to that level, because it does rely on them to sort of bring that level of diligence to the table. And so it's definitely a two-way conversation.
And that question I've noticed is, where do we look actually? Where are the resources? Kind of like what Wing Sung Myo is talking about. Like, I've never heard of this archive. How do they, where do they look, and how do we make them visible?
Yeah, so that's a question for all educators in general. It's such a huge one that I think everybody is trying to figure out right now. It's obviously a lot easier now that we have the internet. But the other thing too is, I think, I don't want to say that it's it sounds like a trite answer, but design students could use the library a little bit more. There's a lot of things in the libraries that they can sort of mine. And obviously, we're not experts in using the library either, because our education was in design. And so, I do think that there is, to some extent, some deficit in design education in terms of those types of historical research skills that even we are still learning right now, honestly, right, doing this project. And so that's one thing to help them with that, because it gives them access to things. Because design, like typography, it's often filed under print history, and then that's often filed under, sociology or economics or these other things that, you would never think to look in, but they're there.
Right.
And so design history, because design in general, graphic design, is such a new field that you have to kind of look very hard to find those things that are already there, perhaps in your local library. The second thing from there is, once you have that, you're able to then kind of dig deeper and then to connect with sort of different communities around the world, but even there, right, there's always kind of differences in viewpoints and in how people view these similar forms. The example that we gave is this computer scientist, right? And they're looking at type like, oh yeah, it's just mathematical transformations. Let's do an italic, because we can. that's totally, you ask a type designer, they would just probably get angry at you and throw some bricks at you, right? But it highlights this kind of just sort of different ways in viewing, in these communities viewing the same thing. And so the other skill that we've that students should have, but maybe they're not taught, or it's kind of, it's a more difficult one to learn. And even when we're still learning this too, is the differences in different communities viewing the same thing. And that also makes it challenging, I think, for people to approach this subject. So yeah.
Well, I think it strikes me. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Go ahead, YuJune.
Even one of the biggest challenges has been translation, right? Because there's so much great writing about typography in different languages that haven't been translated yet into English. And so I think this is a challenge for the entire design education community, right? How do we find a way to make these resources more available? How can we connect with each other in better ways? How do we aggregate resources? I think like the AIGA is trying some stuff. They have that initiative out, thinking outside the Bauhaus, but everything is quite nascent. And so I think this is a challenge for the design education community that should be really taken up within the next 5 years.
I know that we're starting to come down to the end of the time that we have, and I'd like to kind of connect. Wing Sum Yao just asked another question that I think is really all kind of relevant here about people studying design not really, and I think it's not just. It's certainly not just in Hong Kong. It's not just in one culture or the other. I think
there's a lot of
people look at. I think I think just, again, like my own thought process going into study graphic design was I like art and I want to make a living, so I guess that must be what I want to study. It turns out I was right. I actually really enjoy it and I love it, and I'm glad that I've been doing it for 25 years or whatever. But I think it is it's teaching how to learn. I think that's really the heart of it, and it's something that is very close to home for me working on the web, because that it's such a rapidly changing field that if you're not always learning, you're just constantly falling behind. But it's striking me that that's a very narrow view on my part, that it really applies to every aspect of design. And I think what you mentioned, a friend of mine, Mitch Goldstein, writes a lot about learning and practicing and making. He teaches at Rochester here in New York, and I think it is that it's a muscle that you have to exercise, and learning how to find things is kind of at the heart of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I do have to say, I mean, this particular question about design being seen as merely creative and doesn't require research. I mean, we see that all the time actually in the US as well. So I think it's like a general worldwide phenomenon. I mean, I think in some ways we're a little bit, how do I say this? We understand why people might think that, right? Because design in general, the way it was recognized, has relationship with advertising and the way that kind of that history has unfolded. Especially in the US, I think maybe a little bit less so in Europe. There's more of an art, angle and things like that. But at least in the US, that's been the case. And so we still see that now. And, our students, the first thing they were like, I want a job. Like, they tend to view things through that lens as well. So, I don't think it's a unique phenomenon to Asian cities. But, for us, what we try to have them think about is, this type of, just creative practice, that's just one way of looking at design, right? Like it is definitely a way that we all need to come to terms with, right? Like YuJune and I, we run a practice, we work with commercial clients, we understand like this is necessary. But it also is, you can take the same skill set and kind of look at things and try to understand them. And just even asking that question allows sort of our students to maybe think about things in a slightly different way, to say, oh, okay, maybe it doesn't need to go into the whole let's make a logo land quite yet. Maybe we can try to understand something about it, because the thing that designers have in general is that we have the ability to make things. that's a skill that nobody else has, not even the design strategists or the writers or whoever UX people. And that's, I think actually together we should maybe talk about that more, at least. Yeah.
Well, that's, I always, well,
No,
I never hire designers that don't know how to write HTML or CSS. I don't necessarily want them to do that every day, unless they want to, but that's the material. That's the material in which I work, and that's where I focus. So if you don't know about die cuts or vellum or overprinting or varnishes, like you can't even think to design those things for print. So it's just, I feel like it's the same idea.
It is. And it's going to take collective effort, I think. It will take time to maybe move even universities to kind of recognize this. Some of our colleagues don't know what we do either, in the art department. So let's not even talk about our students. It's like, so it's,
Well, I know, I hate to even have to bring it up again, but I know we're about to have to shut down the recording. I don't know if you have the time or the inclination. I know some people will just kind of shift over to the Hangout space, and often there's a chance to get lots more people into the conversation. So if you're game, then people are welcome to join us over there.
Yeah, I think we can stay for a few minutes and continue.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again so much. It's really been wonderful.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Dina. And thank you, everybody.
All right. Take care, everybody. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.